The clock read 9:47 in the morning when Hillary Rodham Clinton realized she had made a mistake. Not the mistake of resisting the subpoena for 6 months, though that was certainly a mistake. Not the mistake of deleting 33,000 emails, though history would remember that one. Not even the mistake of underestimating the man sitting 3 feet away, though that was perhaps the most consequential mistake of all. The mistake she made at 9:47 was simpler and more immediate. She smiled. It was the smile she had perfected over 40 years in public life. The smile that said, "I have been here before." The smile that said, "I know how this works." The smile that said, "You are not the first person to try this and you will not be the last, and I am still standing." It was a good smile. It had served her well through Whitewater and Travelgate, and the Rose law firm billing records, and the Mark Rich pardon, and the Senate race, and the Iraq war vote, and the reset button with Russia and Benghazi, and the private server and 2 presidential campaigns, and 1,000 smaller controversies that would have ended lesser careers. But J.D. Vance was not trying to end her career. He was trying to do something much simpler and infinitely more dangerous. He was trying to make her tell the truth. The hearing room in the Russell Senate office building holds 214 people when every seat is filled. On March 18, 2026, every seat was filled. The press gallery, normally half empty even for high-profile hearings, had reporters standing in the aisles. The public gallery had a line stretching down the hallway that had started forming at 5 in the morning. Security had to turn away more than 300 people. 42 cameras were positioned throughout the room. 17 were from major networks. 12 were from cable news. 8 were from international outlets. 5 were from online platforms that had not existed when Hillary Clinton first testified before Congress in 1993. Every single one of those cameras was recording when J.D. Vance walked through the main entrance. This was, as several political observers would note in the hours that followed, unusual. Committee chairs typically entered through a side door near the dais. It was practical, it was efficient, it was invisible to the cameras. But Vance walked the full length of the hearing room. He walked past the security checkpoint where staffers were still being processed. He walked past the front row of the public gallery where 3 women sat with expressions that cameras would later identify as somewhere between hope and rage. He walked past the press section where every head turned and every phone came up to capture the moment. He carried nothing but a single leather folder. He did not smile. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge the murmur that followed him like a wake. Hillary Clinton watched him approach. She had been seated at the witness table for 52 minutes. This too was deliberate. She had learned decades ago that power in a hearing room belongs to whoever arrives first. The person who is already seated when the committee enters is the person who looks comfortable, the person who looks like they own the space. She wore a navy blue pantsuit precisely tailored. Her hair was perfect, not a strand out of place. Her makeup was camera-ready but not theatrical. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had testified before Congress more than 30 times, who had been questioned by prosecutors and inspectors general and special counsels and hostile senators and even more hostile House members, who had survived 11 hours of Benghazi testimony and emerged by most accounts having won. She looked at J.D. Vance with an expression that political veterans would recognize immediately. It was the expression reserved for opponents who had been measured, assessed, and found manageable. It was calm. It was patient. It was the expression of someone who had been doing this since before the man walking toward her was born. This was, strictly speaking, true. Hillary Clinton had first appeared before Congress in 1993 to discuss health care reform. J.D. Vance had been 9 years old. He had been living in Middletown, Ohio, in a house where the lights sometimes did not work because the electric bill had not been paid. His mother had been cycling through the chaos that addiction brings into a family. His grandmother, the woman he called Mama, had been the only stable force in a childhood defined by instability. The idea that he would one day sit in a Senate hearing room and question the former First Lady, the former Senator, the former Secretary of State, the woman who had received 65 million votes for president, was as plausible as the idea that he would one day walk on Mars. But 27 years had passed. He had joined the Marines after September 11th. He had deployed to Iraq as a combat correspondent. He had come home and used the GI Bill to get through Ohio State in 2 years. He had gone to Yale Law School, where he had been surrounded by the children of the very people who had built the system that Hillary Clinton represented. He had written a book about growing up poor in America. The book had become a bestseller, then a movie, then a cultural touchstone. He had run for Senate from Ohio. He had won. He had become vice president at 40. And now he was here. Vance reached the dais and sat down. He did not look up immediately. He opened the leather folder and appeared to read something inside it. The room, 214 people, 42 cameras, a silence so complete that the ventilation system became audible, waited. 10 seconds passed. In a hearing room, 10 seconds is an eternity. It is long enough for every person present to become acutely aware of their own breathing, long enough for the witness to begin wondering what is in that folder, long enough for the press to start composing the opening line of their stories, long enough for the audience to lean forward in their seats. When Vance finally looked up, his expression had not changed. He looked directly at Hillary Clinton. "Secretary Clinton," he said. His voice was quiet, not soft, not gentle, quiet. The voice of someone who does not need volume because they have something more useful, precision. "Thank you for appearing today. I want to begin by acknowledging something that I think needs to be said clearly and without qualification. You have one of the most distinguished records of public service in American history. First Lady of the United States during a period of economic prosperity. United States Senator from New York, representing millions of people through challenging times, including September 11th. Secretary of State during a period of extraordinary complexity in global affairs. Presidential candidate who received more votes than any woman in American history. That is a record that very few Americans can match, and I want to acknowledge it sincerely before we proceed." Hillary Clinton inclined her head. It was a gracious nod, the nod of someone accepting what they consider their due. "Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I also want to acknowledge," Vance continued in the exact same tone without a pause, "that you resisted a congressional subpoena for more than 6 months. That you were nearly held in criminal contempt of Congress by a bipartisan vote that included 9 members of your own party. That you are seated at this table today not because you chose to cooperate with a congressional investigation, but because the alternative was a criminal referral to the Department of Justice." The nod stopped. "Both of those things are true," Vance said. "Your distinguished service and your extraordinary resistance to oversight. And this hearing exists to determine which one defines your legacy. The question is not whether you have served. The question is whether you have been accountable. And those are not the same thing." The hearing had its origins in events that had unfolded over the previous 8 months. In July of 2025, the Department of Justice had begun releasing documents related to its investigation of Jeffrey Epstein. The release had been mandated by a federal court order following years of litigation by journalists and victims' rights organizations. By February of 2026, more than 3.5 million pages had been disclosed. The documents included flight logs, scheduling records, email correspondence, financial transactions, testimonies from victims, testimonies from witnesses, evidence that painted a detailed picture of how one of the most prolific sex traffickers in modern history had operated for more than 2 decades while maintaining relationships with some of the most powerful people in the world. Among those powerful people was former President Bill Clinton. The flight logs showed that he had flown on Epstein's private aircraft, a Boeing 727 that victims later called the Lolita Express, at least 26 times. The destinations included New York, Florida, Paris, Bangkok, and Brunei. On several flights, the logs indicated that Secret Service agents had not accompanied the former president. On other flights, the logs listed passengers identified only by first names or initials. The Department of Justice documents also included email correspondence between Clinton's scheduling office and Epstein's assistants. The emails discussed travel arrangements, meeting logistics, events at Epstein's properties including his Manhattan townhouse, his Palm Beach estate, and his private island in the Caribbean. When the documents became public, the House Oversight Committee had announced an investigation. The investigation was bipartisan from the beginning. The committee chairman was a Republican from Texas. The ranking member was a Democrat from California. Both had issued a joint statement saying that the investigation would follow the evidence wherever it led, and that no one, regardless of their position or party, would be exempt from scrutiny. The committee had subpoenaed testimony from multiple individuals connected to Epstein, including lawyers, employees, associates, and political figures who had been named in the documents. Bill Clinton had been subpoenaed. Hillary Clinton had been subpoenaed. Both had resisted. Bill Clinton's legal team had argued that the former president was too ill to provide testimony in person and had requested permission to submit written answers. Medical records had been provided to support this claim. The committee had consulted with independent medical experts who reviewed the records and concluded that while the former president had health issues that would require accommodations, in-person testimony with appropriate breaks and medical support was medically feasible. The committee had ordered in-person testimony to proceed. Hillary Clinton's legal team had taken a different approach. They had argued that the subpoena was overbroad, that the investigation was politically motivated, that the former Secretary of State should not be required to testify about matters related to her husband's activities, that written answers would be more appropriate and efficient. The committee had rejected every argument. When both Clintons failed to appear for scheduled deposition dates in January, the House Oversight Committee had voted to recommend contempt of Congress charges. The vote on Bill Clinton had been 27-4. 9 Democrats had voted with the Republican majority. The vote on Hillary Clinton had been 24-7. 3 Democrats had voted to hold her in contempt. The bipartisan nature of the votes had been more significant than the votes themselves. For 40 years, the Clintons had survived investigations by framing them as partisan witch hunts, Republican-led inquiries into Democratic targets, political theater designed to damage opponents rather than uncover truth. The Epstein investigation had shattered that framework. Democrats were demanding accountability. Democrats were voting to hold the Clintons in contempt. Democrats were saying publicly that no one was above the law. When the contempt recommendations reached the House floor, it had become clear that they would pass with overwhelming bipartisan support. Faced with the certainty of criminal contempt charges, the Clintons had agreed to testify. Bill Clinton's deposition had taken place on February 26, 2026. It had been conducted behind closed doors. The transcript had not been released, but multiple members of the committee, both Republicans and Democrats, had characterized his testimony as evasive and contradicted by documentary evidence. Hillary Clinton's deposition had taken place the same day. Within 72 hours, characterizations of her testimony had leaked to the press. Evasive, vague, inconsistent with documents, multiple instances of "I don't recall" in response to specific questions about specific dates. The Senate Judiciary Committee had convened this public hearing to address the contradictions, and J.D. Vance, exercising a rarely used constitutional prerogative as President of the Senate, had chosen to preside personally. Secretary Clinton, Vance said, "Before I ask my first question, I want to explain how I intend to conduct this hearing. I am not going to make speeches. I am not going to editorialize. I am going to ask you questions. Specific questions with specific dates and specific names. I am going to compare your answers to documents that are part of the public record. If your answers are consistent with the documents, this will be a relatively short hearing. If they are not consistent, it will be longer. Do you understand?" "I understand," Clinton said. Her voice was steady, warm, professional, the voice of someone who had been through this many times before and knew exactly how to handle it. "Good," Vance said. "Then let's begin. But I don't want to start with Jeffrey Epstein. I want to start with something that happened 9 years ago. I want to start with your emails." There was a murmur in the gallery. Clinton's attorney, seated directly behind her, shifted in his chair. This was not what anyone had expected. The hearing had been called to address questions about Epstein. The press had prepared stories about Epstein. The protesters outside the building were carrying signs about Epstein. But Vance was starting with emails. He opened the folder. In March of 2015, the New York Times reported that you had used a private email server to conduct official business during your tenure as Secretary of State. The House Select Committee on Benghazi subsequently issued a subpoena for emails related to your time at the State Department. At the time the subpoena was issued, your private server contained approximately 60,000 emails. You turned over approximately 30,000 of those emails to the State Department. The other 30,000, approximately 33,000 emails, were deleted. Is that sequence of events accurate? My legal team conducted a review of the emails on the server, Clinton said. They determined that approximately half of those emails were personal in nature. Family correspondence, scheduling for personal matters, communications that were not related to government business. Those emails were not responsive to the subpoena and were therefore not preserved. You have described these personal emails publicly as including things like yoga schedules, recipes, and correspondence about your daughter's wedding, Vance said. Is that correct? Among other things, yes, that's correct. 33,000 emails about yoga and recipes, Vance said. That is a substantial amount of correspondence about personal wellness and cooking. There was scattered laughter in the gallery. Clinton's expression did not change. Secretary Clinton, who made the determination about which emails were personal and which were government records. My legal team, in consultation with State Department guidelines. Not the State Department itself. No. Not the FBI. No. Not the National Archives. No. Your personally retained attorneys decided which government records would be preserved and which would be destroyed. The lawyers I retained reviewed the materials, yes. And the method of destruction was a software program called BleachBit. BleachBit is specifically designed to make deleted files unrecoverable even by forensic analysis. Is that correct? I believe that is one of the functions of the software, yes. And this deletion occurred after the congressional subpoena had been issued. The timeline was, Clinton began. Secretary Clinton, Vance interrupted gently. I'm not asking about the timeline in general. I'm asking about the sequence. The subpoena came first, then the deletion. Is that correct? The preservation and deletion process was conducted in accordance with. I'm asking about the sequence. Subpoena first, deletion second. Yes or no? A pause. Yes. In any courtroom in America, Vance said, destroying evidence after a legal preservation order has been issued is called spoliation of evidence. In many jurisdictions, it is a criminal offense. Are you familiar with that legal term? I am familiar with it, yes. And I would note that this matter was thoroughly investigated by the FBI and Director Kamei found. Let me address the FBI investigation, Vance said. In July of 2016, FBI Director James Kamei held a press conference in which he stated that your handling of classified information was extremely careless. Those were his exact words, extremely careless. But he recommended no prosecution. For 8 years, that recommendation was treated as the final word on the matter. But last summer, Senator Grassley successfully declassified portions of the Department of Justice Inspector General's report. These declassified materials, sometimes called the Clinton Annex, revealed that the FBI investigation was incomplete. Specifically, the FBI failed to examine thumb drives that had been obtained during the investigation. The Inspector General described this as a failure to perform fundamental investigative work. The investigation that cleared you, Secretary Clinton, was never finished. The FBI stopped before completing their analysis. Mr. Vice President, I cannot speak to internal FBI decisions about investigative methodology. No, you cannot. And that is precisely my point. You were cleared by an investigation that, according to the Inspector General, was incomplete. And the evidence that might have provided answers, the 33,000 emails, was destroyed by your team after the subpoena was issued using software specifically designed to prevent recovery. We will never know what was in those emails. That is not an accident. That is a result. He closed that section of the folder and opened another. Now I want to discuss the Steele dossier, because there is a pattern emerging here and I want to make sure it is visible. You destroyed evidence that could have incriminated you, but you also created evidence that was used against your opponent. He laid it out methodically. The Clinton campaign had retained the law firm Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie had retained the research firm Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS had retained Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer. Steele had compiled a dossier of allegations against Donald Trump. The dossier was based on anonymous sources. Much of it was later discredited. The dossier was provided to the FBI and became part of the justification for FISA surveillance warrants against Carter Page, a Trump campaign associate. The Clinton campaign had reported its payments to Perkins Coie as legal services on Federal Election Commission filings. The FEC later fined the campaign because this characterization was false. The payments were for opposition research, not legal services. You paid for opposition research against your opponent, Vance said. You disguised those payments on federal campaign disclosure forms. The product of that research was fed to federal law enforcement. It was used to justify surveillance of your opponent's campaign, and it triggered a multi-year investigation that consumed the first term of the Trump administration. The Durham report later concluded that the FBI lacked sufficient basis to open that investigation. Secretary Clinton, did your campaign pay for the Steele dossier? My campaign retained legal counsel who made various decisions in the course of. Yes or no? Did money from your campaign fund the creation of the Steele dossier? Her attorney leaned forward and whispered something. Clinton paused, then spoke. Funds were allocated to legal services which included opposition research among other activities. That is a yes. Thank you for confirming. Now the Clinton Foundation. This section moved faster. The facts were well established. The Associated Press had investigated and found that 85 of 154 private individuals who met with Secretary Clinton at the State Department had donated to the Clinton Foundation. The total from those donors was $156 million. UBS, the Swiss banking giant, had increased its foundation donations from $60,000 to $600,000 after the State Department under Clinton's leadership had intervened in a tax dispute involving the bank. UBS had also paid Bill Clinton $1.5 million in speaking fees. Bill Clinton's speaking fees from foreign entities had risen dramatically during his wife's tenure as Secretary of State. Russia paid $500,000 for a single speech. Chinese organizations paid $750,000. Secretary Clinton, Vance said, when 55% of the private citizens who get a meeting with the Secretary of State have donated to the Secretary of State's family foundation, what would you call that arrangement? The Clinton Foundation has provided vital assistance to millions of people around the world. It has been one of the most impactful. That is not an answer to my question. That is a talking point. I'm asking you to characterize the arrangement. 55% of your private meetings went to foundation donors. What is the word for that? There was never any quid pro quo. My decisions as Secretary of State were made on policy grounds. Let me ask about Haiti specifically, Vance said. After the earthquake in 2010, the Clinton Foundation raised more than $30 million for relief efforts. Reconstruction contracts went largely to foreign companies rather than Haitian firms. Your brother, Tony Rodham, was appointed to the advisory board of a mining company that received a rare gold mining permit in Haiti. The Haitian government had not issued such a permit in over 50 years. Were you aware of your brother's involvement in that company? My brother's business activities were separate from my official duties. Were you aware of his involvement? Yes or no? I may have been informed at some point. You were informed. Your brother got a gold mine. The Haitian people got rubble, and the Clinton Foundation got $30 million. I want to make sure everyone heard that correctly. He paused. The room was completely silent. Now Jeffrey Epstein. The silence deepened. It was not simply the absence of sound. It was the presence of attention so intense it became almost physical. 214 people stopped moving simultaneously. Secretary Clinton, I am going to read you a series of dates. Each date corresponds to a flight documented in Jeffrey Epstein's flight logs or to an event documented in scheduling records or email correspondence released by the Department of Justice. I am going to ask you what you knew about each event. These are not hypothetical questions. These are specific documented events. He read the first date. March 14, 2002. A flight from New York to Palm Beach on Epstein's aircraft. Passengers listed included your husband, Ghislaine Maxwell, and 3 individuals identified only by first names. Were you aware that your husband was on that flight? I don't have a specific recollection of my husband's travel schedule from that time period. You don't recall. Second date. November 23, 2003. A flight from Miami to Bangkok with multiple stops. Your husband was listed as a passenger. Were you aware of this trip? Again, I don't have a detailed recollection of. Third date, February 6, 2004. Your husband attended an event at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. This was documented in calendar records found during the FBI search of the property. Were you aware he attended this event? I would have to review my records from that period. You don't recall. Fourth date, July 9, 2005. Your husband flew from New York to London on Epstein's aircraft. This was during your first term as a United States Senator. Were you aware of this flight? I'm not certain of my awareness at that specific time. Secretary Clinton, Vance said, I notice a pattern in your answers. When I ask you about matters that reflect favorably on your record, you recall details with great precision. You recalled the timeline of the Benghazi attack during 11 hours of testimony. You recalled the structure of your email server arrangement. You recalled your work at the State Department. But when I ask you about your husband's 26 documented flights on a convicted sex trafficker's private aircraft, your memory becomes unreliable. That is not forgetfulness. That is selection. Clinton straightened in her chair. When she spoke, her voice had an edge. Mr. Vice President, my husband has addressed his association with Jeffrey Epstein publicly. He has stated that he knew nothing of Mr. Epstein's crimes and that he ended their association before the 2006 charges. I have nothing to add to his public statements. I'm not asking about your husband's statements, Vance said. I am asking about your knowledge. You were married to a former president who flew on a convicted sex trafficker's aircraft 26 times. You had a Secret Service detail that coordinated with your husband's protection team. You had a scheduling office that coordinated with external parties. The Department of Justice has released emails showing communication between your staff and Epstein's office, and your testimony is that you recall nothing about any of this. I have no independent recollection of those specific communications. Vance let the answer sit in the air. He did not comment. He did not shake his head. He simply let 3 seconds pass in complete silence. Secretary Clinton, you resisted this subpoena for more than 6 months. Your legal team filed multiple motions arguing the subpoena was invalid. You requested written answers instead of live testimony. You missed multiple scheduled deposition dates. When the House Oversight Committee moved to hold you in contempt, 9 Democrats voted in favor. 9 members of your own party, people who had defended you through decades of investigations. They voted to hold you in criminal contempt of Congress. Why did you fight for 6 months to avoid answering these questions? I was not fighting to avoid questions. My legal team had legitimate concerns about the scope and procedures. Your legal team had concerns about procedures. The survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes had concerns about justice. They wanted the most powerful woman in American politics to answer questions about the man who trafficked them. They wanted accountability. And for 6 months, you said no. He leaned forward slightly. Whose concerns should matter more, Secretary Clinton? Your lawyer's concerns about procedure or their concerns about justice? The question hung in the room. Clinton did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. I have tremendous sympathy for anyone who was victimized by Jeffrey Epstein, and I have cooperated fully with. You cooperated after being threatened with criminal contempt. That is not cooperation. That is compliance under duress. And since you have raised the subject of sympathy for victims, since you have invoked your concern for women who have been harmed, I want to address something I had hoped would not be necessary to discuss. Throughout your career, you have positioned yourself as a champion of women's rights. You have spoken powerfully about believing women who come forward with allegations of sexual misconduct. You ran for president in part on that platform. But there are women who have accused your husband of sexual assault and harassment. Juanita Broderick, who said your husband raped her in 1978. Kathleen Willey, who said he groped her in the Oval Office in 1993. Paula Jones, who filed a sexual harassment lawsuit that your husband settled for $850,000. And according to testimony from people who were present during those years, staffers, journalists, political operatives, you were not passive. You participated actively in efforts to discredit these women. You described one of them privately as a narcissistic Looney Tune. Your associates hired private investigators to gather damaging information about these women. The operation to silence them was systematic and effective. And then in 2016, you stood on a debate stage and said that every woman who makes an allegation of sexual assault deserves to be believed. That was your phrase, deserves to be believed, unless apparently she is accusing your husband. Clinton's attorney was leaning forward urgently. Clinton herself had gone very still. Mr. Vice President, these characterizations they are documented, they are sourced. They are part of the public record. And they are relevant to this hearing because we are here to discuss your relationship with the most prolific sex trafficker in modern American history. Your credibility as a witness depends in part on your history of how you have treated women who made allegations of sexual crimes against people close to you. You championed women in public. You worked to silence women in private. You expressed sympathy for Epstein's victims while fighting for 6 months to avoid answering questions about him. The word for that is hypocrisy, and the survivors sitting in this gallery can see it clearly. For the first time in the hearing, sound came from the gallery, not applause. Security would have stopped applause, but a murmur, a shifting, the sound of people who had been waiting years to hear something said aloud. He turned to the final section of the folder. Secretary Clinton, I want to identify a pattern that runs through your entire career. Not isolated incidents, but a consistent approach to accountability. Let me start with Benghazi. September 11, 2012. The American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked. Ambassador Chris Stevens was killed. Sean Smith was killed. Tyrone Woods was killed. Glenn Doherty was killed. 4 Americans dead. In the immediate aftermath, your administration told the public that the attack grew out of a spontaneous protest against a YouTube video. Ambassador Susan Rice appeared on 5 Sunday news shows and repeated this explanation. Your State Department issued press releases attributing the attack to the video. But on the night of the attack, September 11, 2012, you sent an email to your daughter Chelsea. In that email, you wrote that the attack was carried out by an Al-Qaeda-like group, not a spontaneous protest, not a response to a video, an Al-Qaeda-like group. You knew that night, while Americans were still dying, that it was terrorism. And yet 3 days later, at Andrews Air Force Base, at the ceremony where the remains of those 4 Americans were returned to American soil, you told their families that you would make sure the filmmaker who made that YouTube video was arrested and prosecuted. You knew it was terrorism. You told the families it was a video. Clinton's expression shifted fractionally. The first visible crack in her composure, quickly repaired. Mr. Vice President, the intelligence in those first hours was fluid. Multiple agencies were providing different assessments. The intelligence you provided to your daughter was not fluid. You told Chelsea it was Al-Qaeda the same night it happened. There was no ambiguity in that email. The ambiguity was reserved for the American public and for the families of the dead. And 5 months later, when Senator Ron Johnson pressed you on this contradiction in a Senate hearing under oath, you responded with 5 words that would be played millions of times. What difference at this point does it make? Those were your exact words to the families of 4 dead Americans. What difference does it make? He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He simply recited the facts and let them carry their own weight. Now let me add another piece to this pattern. In 2016, the Democratic National Committee held a presidential primary. Your opponent was Senator Bernie Sanders. WikiLeaks released internal DNC emails showing that party officials had actively worked to undermine Sanders during what was supposed to be a neutral process. DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned. Her successor, Donna Brazile, later wrote in her memoir that she found proof the primary had been rigged and that it broke her heart. Brazile also disclosed that she had given your campaign debate questions in advance, a direct violation of the debate rules. A joint fundraising agreement between your campaign and the DNC gave your campaign control over party finances and strategy before you had won the nomination. You speak frequently about threats to democracy. You have described your opponents as dangers to democratic norms, but you rigged a Democratic primary against a candidate that millions of your own party's voters supported. You received stolen debate questions. And when it was exposed, your campaign blamed Russian interference, which, whether true or not, does not change the content of the emails. The emails were real. The rigging was real. The questions were real. And in September of that same year, September 9th, 2016, you stood at a fundraiser and described half of Donald Trump's supporters as belonging in a basket of deplorables. You called them racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic. 63 million Americans voted for your opponent. You called roughly 30 million of them deplorable. I was one of those voters, Secretary Clinton. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother battled addiction. My grandmother raised me. I joined the Marines after September 11th. I deployed to Iraq. I came home and went to college on the GI Bill. I went to Yale Law School, and according to you, I was deplorable. He paused. I grew up in a place where people who lied under oath went to prison. I went to Yale Law School where I learned that sometimes they become Secretary of State. The gallery was completely silent. That is the pattern, Secretary Clinton. Benghazi. You knew it was terrorism, you blamed a video, you lied to families. When questioned, what difference does it make? Emails. 33,000 destroyed after subpoena using software designed to prevent recovery. When questioned, like with a cloth, the dossier. You paid for it, disguised it, fed it to law enforcement. When questioned, partisan witch hunt. The foundation. Donors got meetings, your brother got a gold mine, Haiti got rubble. When questioned, we've helped millions. The primary. You rigged it, got the questions, controlled the party. When questioned, Russian interference. Epstein. You refused to testify for 6 months about a trafficker connected to your family. When questioned, I don't recall. He set down his pen. The pattern is clear. Destroy evidence when it threatens you. Create evidence when it threatens opponents. Sell access through your foundation. Rig primaries against your own party's voters. Lie to families of dead Americans. Call half the country deplorable. Refuse to answer questions about the trafficking of young women. And when confronted with documentary evidence, say, I don't recall. Secretary Clinton, there is a word for someone who does all of these things. Someone who destroys evidence when investigated, manufactures evidence against opponents, converts public office into personal wealth, denigrates millions of Americans, and refuses accountability for association with a sex trafficker. That word is not public servant. The word is above the law, and the only question this hearing must answer is whether that description applies to you. Hillary Clinton had been in public life for 40 years. She had survived scandals that ended other political careers. She had been investigated by independent counsels, special prosecutors, inspectors general, and congressional committees. She had testified under oath more times than most politicians testify in their entire careers. She had faced hostile questioners in hearing rooms designed for confrontation, and she had survived every single time by deploying one weapon, the speech. When the facts were against her, she gave a speech about service. When the questions were specific, she gave a speech about context. When the evidence was damning, she gave a speech about partisanship. The speech had been her shield and her sword. It had never failed, not through Whitewater, not through the impeachment, not through the email server, not through Benghazi, not through 2 presidential campaigns. She deployed it now. Mr. Vice President, she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. I have served this country for 40 years. I have been First Lady during a period of unprecedented prosperity. I represented the people of New York in the United States Senate. I served as Secretary of State during some of the most dangerous years in modern history. I have been investigated more than any woman in American political history. I have been accused, attacked, subpoenaed, deposed, and vilified by political opponents who have spent more taxpayer money investigating me than was spent investigating the 2008 financial crisis. She leaned forward, and I am still here. I am still sitting at this table answering your questions, because I have done nothing wrong. The investigations have concluded. The prosecutors have declined to bring charges. The committees have issued their reports. And every single time, the conclusion has been the same. No wrongdoing. So you can read dates and cite documents and construct patterns. But the pattern that matters, the pattern established by 4 decades of investigation, is that I have been cleared every single time. It was by any measure a powerful moment. It was the speech her supporters would clip and share for weeks. It was delivered with conviction and authority. It was the speech of someone who believed every word and had 40 years of surviving investigations to validate that belief. Vance waited. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He sat with his hands folded, watching her with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this and prepared for exactly this. "Are you finished, Secretary Clinton?" She looked at him. "I am good because I have one more question, and it is the simplest question I will ask all day." He removed his glasses and set them on the desk. He looked at her with nothing between them. "Secretary Clinton, in your 40 years of public service, through all those investigations, all those subpoenas, all those hearings, all those press conferences, have you ever said the following words: 'I was wrong. I made a mistake. Here is what happened. Here is what I know. Not I take responsibility,' which is what politicians say when they want credit for accountability without being accountable. Not 'mistakes were made,' which is a sentence carefully constructed to have no subject, but the actual words: 'I was wrong. Here is the complete truth.'" Clinton opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Vance waited. He had learned patience in places where patience was survival, in a childhood where the next crisis was always one phone call away, in the Marines where patience was discipline, in law school where patience was strategy. He understood that the most powerful tool in cross-examination was not the question. It was the silence after the question. The silence that forced the witness to fill the space with whatever truth or evasion they possessed. Clinton filled the space. "I have always tried to be forthcoming with the American people and with congressional investigators." "That is not what I asked," Vance said. "I asked whether you have ever said I was wrong and then provided a complete and truthful account. Not I've tried to be forthcoming. Not I take responsibility. Not I've addressed this previously. Not mistakes were made. I am asking for one example. One time in 40 years when you said I was wrong and then told the whole truth." The silence lasted 4 seconds. In real time, 4 seconds is barely noticeable. A breath, a heartbeat. But in a hearing room with 214 people and 42 cameras, and 4 decades of American political history pressing down on a single witness table, 4 seconds is geologic. It is the silence in which structures crack. It is the silence that answers more powerfully than any words could. "I believe," Hillary Clinton said, "that my record speaks for itself." J.D. Vance looked at her for one more second. Then he said 5 words that would be replayed more than her speech, more than any answer she had given, more than anything spoken in that room in 40 years of congressional hearings. "Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does." He closed the folder. He did not summarize. He did not make a closing statement. He did not explain what had just happened. He said 4 words: "This hearing is adjourned." He stood. He walked the length of the hearing room the same way he had entered, past the gallery, past the press section, past the rows of people who had waited since before dawn. He did not stop. He did not take questions. He did not look back. Clinton remained at the witness table for 11 seconds after the gavel. Her attorney was speaking to her. An aide was holding her coat. Reporters were shouting questions from behind the security rope. She looked at none of them. She looked at the empty chair where Vance had been sitting. Her expression, captured by a C-SPAN camera and frozen in a screenshot that would circulate for years, was the expression of someone who had just encountered something they could not survive by giving a speech. She stood. She walked out. Her statement, released 43 minutes later, read: "Today's hearing was a political exercise designed to relitigate matters that have been thoroughly investigated and conclusively resolved. I remain committed to transparency and accountability." The statement received 1.9 million engagements on social media. The video clip of "I believe my record speaks for itself," followed by "Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does," received 92 million views in 72 hours. The reactions were predictably divided along partisan lines. Liberal commentators praised her closing speech as defiant and dignified. Conservative commentators called the hearing a reckoning 3 decades overdue. Cable news played both clips on loop, but the neutral analysis, the kind that appeared in law reviews and journalism schools and private conversations among people who studied congressional oversight, identified something both partisan narratives missed. Vance had not attacked Clinton. He had not raised his voice. He had not made speeches about institutional decay. He had asked questions, specific, documented, verifiable questions, and Clinton had not answered them. She had responded, she had redirected, she had contextualized, she had deployed 40 years of practice technique, but she had not answered. "I don't recall. My legal team reviewed. I cannot speak to FBI methodology. I have always tried to be forthcoming." These were not answers. They were evasions. polished by decades of practice until they resembled answers, until they sounded like answers, until most listeners would accept them as answers. But they were not answers. And Vance, by refusing to argue with the evasions, by simply moving to the next question and the next and the next, each one more precise than the last, had made the evasions visible. This was what separated Vance from every Republican who had tried to corner Hillary Clinton in a hearing room. Trey Gowdy had tried anger. Jim Jordan had tried volume. Lindsey Graham had tried moral outrage. They had all failed because Clinton was better at absorbing anger than they were at projecting it. She thrived on their emotion. Their fury made her calm look presidential. Their volume made her restraint look dignified. Their outrage gave her the role of the rational adult in the room. Vance gave her nothing to absorb. He asked questions the way a surgeon makes incisions, precisely, without emotion, each one opening something that could not be closed. When Clinton deployed her counter-speech, the 40 years of service speech, the most investigated woman speech, the still-standing speech, Vance did not counter it with a speech of his own. He countered it with the simplest question in the English language. Have you ever admitted you were wrong? 4 seconds of silence. That silence was the hearing, not the documents, not the flight logs, not the emails or the foundation or the dossier. The silence. Because in those 4 seconds, the entire country watched the most experienced, most investigated, most resilient political figure of the past half-century search for a single example of genuine accountability in 40 years of public life, and find nothing. 3 of Jeffrey Epstein's survivors issued a joint statement that evening. It read, "For the first time, someone in a position of power asked the questions we have been asking for 20 years. And for the first time, the whole country heard the silence where the answers should have been. We are grateful to Vice President Vance for giving voice to what we have known all along. Power should not place anyone above accountability." Vance gave one statement to reporters outside the Capitol. He said, "I did not go into that hearing room to embarrass anyone. I went in to ask questions that the American people, and more importantly, the survivors deserve to have answered. Secretary Clinton chose not to answer them. That is her right, but she was not invoking the Fifth Amendment. She was invoking something else, something that does not have a name in the Constitution but has operated in Washington for as long as some families have been in power. The assumption that if you are connected enough and have survived enough investigations, you are for practical purposes beyond accountability." A reporter asked whether he thought Clinton had committed perjury. "I am not a prosecutor," Vance said. "I asked questions. She gave responses. The American people can compare her responses to the documentary record. The documents are public. The transcript will be public. Everything is public." Another reporter asked whether the record speaks for itself. Vance almost smiled. "Almost. It always does," he said. Clinton's vehicle left the Russell Senate office building at 11:49 that morning. Inside, she was on the phone before the vehicle reached the street. She was already planning the response. The op-eds, the surrogates, the cable news bookings, the strategy to reframe the hearing as political theater and her testimony as another example of resilience against partisan attack. This was what she did, what she had always done. The Clinton operation, built over 4 decades, maintained by hundreds of loyalists, funded by millions in donations, practiced through countless crises. The machine did not stop because one hearing went badly. The machine never stopped. "But I believe my record speaks for itself" was on every screen in America. And yes, Secretary Clinton, it does, was right behind it. And in the 4 seconds of silence between the question and the non-answer, something had shifted. Not broken, not shattered, shifted. The way a foundation shifts before anyone notices the cracks. For 40 years, Hillary Clinton had operated on one assumption. That survival was vindication. That if you endured the investigation and emerged without indictment, you had been proven innocent. That the absence of prosecution was the presence of exoneration. For 40 years, that assumption had held, through Whitewater, through impeachment, through the email server, through Benghazi, through the foundation controversies, through 2 presidential campaigns, through every hearing and every subpoena and every hostile question. But J.D. Vance had not asked whether she was guilty. He had asked whether she was accountable. And the distance between those two questions, the vast territory between did you commit a crime and have you ever admitted you were wrong, was the territory where Hillary Clinton's legacy would be decided. Not by a prosecutor, not by a jury, not by a congressional vote, by 4 seconds of silence. By the record that speaks for itself. The hearing ended at 12:03 in the afternoon. By 12:30, the clip had been viewed 10 million times. By 6 that evening, 50 million. By midnight, 92 million. The comments sections were predictably divided. She destroyed him. He destroyed her. Partisan witch hunt. About time. But buried in the millions of reactions were thousands of comments that said something different. Something that transcended the usual left-right divide. They came from lawyers who recognized the technique. From journalists who understood what they had witnessed. From ordinary citizens who had watched enough congressional hearings to know the difference between theater and substance. The comments said, he never raised his voice. He never made it personal. He just asked questions and let her answers speak for themselves. That is how you conduct oversight. That is accountability. The Senate Judiciary Committee released the full hearing transcript at 8 p.m. that evening. 347 pages. Every question, every answer, every pause. Media organizations downloaded it immediately and began searching for additional moments. But there were no additional moments. The entire hearing had been captured in the clips already circulating. The opening acknowledgement of her record followed by the acknowledgement of her resistance. The methodical progression through emails, the dossier, the foundation, Haiti, Epstein. The challenge to her 40 years of service speech. And the final question about accountability. Have you ever said I was wrong and told the truth? 4 seconds of silence. I believe my record speaks for itself. Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does. That was the hearing. Everything else was context. 3 days later, CNN published polling data. 62% of Americans who watched the hearing or saw clips believed that Hillary Clinton had not been fully forthcoming in her testimony. This included 38% of Democrats. 47% of Americans believed she should face further investigation related to the Epstein matter. This included 29% of Democrats. The bipartisan nature of the numbers was significant. For 40 years, the Clintons had counted on party loyalty to shield them from consequences. Democrats would defend Democrats. Party came before accountability. The Epstein hearing had fractured that protection. Democrats were breaking ranks. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough that the assumption of automatic party protection no longer held. Enough that other Democrats considering future presidential campaigns were quietly distancing themselves. Enough that the word accountability was being used by Democrats in ways it had not been used before. On March 22nd, 4 days after the hearing, the House Oversight Committee announced that it would hold public hearings on the full scope of the Epstein matter. The committee chairman, a Republican, and the ranking member, a Democrat, issued a joint statement. It read, "The American people deserve a complete accounting of how Jeffrey Epstein operated for more than 2 decades while maintaining relationships with powerful individuals in politics, business, and entertainment. Our investigation will follow the evidence. No one will be exempted because of position or party. This committee's responsibility is to the victims and to the truth." The statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not mention Clinton by name. It did not reference the March 18th hearing. It did not make partisan accusations. It simply stated that the investigation would continue and that accountability would be pursued regardless of who it implicated. This was the new framework. Not Republican versus Democrat. Not political theater versus legitimate oversight. Evidence and accountability. The Clintons had survived for 40 years by making every investigation about partisanship. The Epstein matter had become bipartisan, and in that shift the old playbook stopped working. On March 25th, 1 week after the hearing, Hillary Clinton published an op-ed in the Washington Post. The headline read, "I will not be silenced by those who seek to weaponize tragedy." The article was 2,000 words. It argued that the Epstein investigation was being used by political opponents to relitigate old controversies, that she had cooperated fully with investigators, that her record of public service spoke to her character and integrity, that the real story was not about her, but about the partisan forces trying to destroy her. The op-ed received significant attention. It was shared widely by her supporters. It was cited by commentators who believed she was being unfairly targeted. But it did not change the fundamental dynamic, because the op-ed did exactly what the March 18th hearing had exposed. It redirected, it contextualized, it invoked her record, but it did not answer the questions. When did you learn about your husband's relationship with Epstein? What did your staff know? Why did you resist testifying for 6 months? Have you ever said I was wrong and told the complete truth? The op-ed addressed none of these questions directly. And by not addressing them, it reinforced what the hearing had revealed, that Hillary Clinton had spent 40 years perfecting the art of response without answer. The survivors of Epstein's trafficking operation were not silent. In the week following the hearing, 6 women who had testified in previous legal proceedings related to Epstein gave interviews to various media outlets. They did not coordinate their statements. They did not issue a joint press release. They simply spoke individually about what the hearing had meant to them. One woman, now 39 years old, who had been trafficked by Epstein when she was 16, said, "For 20 years I have been told that these people were too powerful to hold accountable. I was told that no one would believe me. I was told that they had lawyers and resources and connections, and that I had nothing. And then I watched Vice President Vance ask the same questions I have been asking, and I watched her not answer, and I watched the whole country see what I have seen. That power protects itself. But maybe, finally, that is changing." Another woman, now 42, who had been trafficked when she was 17, said, "She talked about sympathy for victims. But when she had the chance to answer questions that might help us understand how this happened and who knew what, she said, I don't recall. That is not sympathy. That is self-protection." Another said, "The silence said everything. When someone cannot give you a simple example of admitting they were wrong in 40 years, you know they believe they are never wrong. That is what power does. It makes you think you are above admitting mistakes." These women were not political operatives. They were not Republican activists. They were survivors who had been fighting for accountability for 2 decades and who saw in the March 18th hearing something they had been waiting for. Questions asked without fear. Evasions exposed without equivocation. Power confronted with evidence. And silence that spoke louder than any answer could have. By the end of March, the political landscape had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Hillary Clinton remained a powerful figure. She still had millions of supporters. She still had access to media platforms. She still had the Clinton Foundation and the network of relationships built over 4 decades. But something had changed. The automatic assumption that she would survive any controversy through a combination of resilience, legal maneuvering, and partisan defense no longer held absolutely. Democrats were asking questions. Media outlets that had previously framed Clinton controversies as partisan attacks were covering the Epstein matter more critically. The phrase "I don't recall" had become shorthand for evasion, and the 4 seconds of silence when asked about admitting mistakes had become a meme, a cultural reference point, a moment that encapsulated decades of frustration with political accountability. J.D. Vance did not speak about the hearing again for 2 weeks. He returned to his duties as vice president. He attended cabinet meetings. He traveled to Ohio for an event on manufacturing. He gave a speech on foreign policy. He did not give interviews about Clinton. He did not write op-eds claiming victory. He did not fundraise off the hearing. This restraint was itself notable. In an era of instant reaction and constant commentary, Vance's silence after the hearing was a form of emphasis. The hearing spoke for itself. The transcript spoke for itself. The record spoke for itself. Adding commentary would have diminished the impact. On April 2nd, 2 weeks after the hearing, Vance gave a speech at Ohio State University, his undergraduate alma mater. The speech was ostensibly about education and opportunity, but near the end he addressed the hearing briefly. He said, "Some of you have asked me about the hearing 2 weeks ago. I want to say something about it, and then I want to move on because there is work to be done. I grew up in a place where accountability mattered. If you lied to your employer, you got fired. If you lied to a judge, you went to jail. If you lied to your family, you lost their trust. The rules were simple and they applied to everyone. When I got to Yale Law School, I learned that the rules are different for some people, that if you are powerful enough and connected enough, you can spend 40 years avoiding accountability and people will call it political skill. They will say you are tough. resilient, unfairly targeted, and maybe all of that is true, but it does not change the fundamental question. Are you accountable? Not are you indicted, not are you prosecuted. Are you accountable? Do you tell the truth? Do you admit mistakes? Do you answer questions directly? Or do you spend 40 years perfecting the art of evasion? The students applauded. Vance waited for the applause to subside. I asked Secretary Clinton a simple question. Have you ever admitted you were wrong and told the complete truth? The answer was 4 seconds of silence followed by my record speaks for itself. That answer tells you everything you need to know about how power operates in Washington. It protects itself, it deflects, it survives, but it does not answer. And the American people deserve leaders who answer. The speech was viewed 3 million times in the first day. It crystallized what many people had felt watching the hearing but had not articulated. The issue was not whether Hillary Clinton was guilty of a crime. The issue was whether she believed she owed anyone the truth, whether accountability applied to her the way it applied to others, whether 40 years of surviving investigations had convinced her that she was beyond the obligation to answer directly. The phrase "my record speaks for itself" became a cultural touchstone. It appeared in political cartoons. It was referenced in late-night comedy. It was used by commentators across the political spectrum, but its meaning shifted depending on who used it. For Clinton's supporters, it meant, she has been investigated countless times and cleared every time. Her record shows she has done nothing wrong. For her critics, it meant, her record of evasion and deflection speaks volumes about her character. For neutral observers, it meant, 4 seconds of silence when asked about admitting mistakes reveals something important about accountability in American politics. All three interpretations were valid. All three captured different aspects of what the hearing had revealed. And that ambiguity, that space for multiple interpretations, was why the moment resonated so powerfully. It was a Rorschach test for American politics. What you saw in those 4 seconds of silence said as much about you as it did about Hillary Clinton. By mid-April, the House Oversight Committee had scheduled 3 additional public hearings related to Epstein. Witnesses included former associates, employees who worked at his properties, and individuals who had attended events where Epstein was present. The committee announced that it would also seek testimony from other political figures who had documented connections to Epstein. The investigation was expanding, and the bipartisan framework that had been established meant that it could not be dismissed as partisan theater. Democrats and Republicans were working together. Evidence was being presented methodically. Witnesses were being questioned carefully. The process was not perfect. There were still partisan moments, still disagreements about scope and relevance, but the fundamental commitment to following the evidence wherever it led remained intact. This was the legacy of the March 18th hearing. Not that it destroyed Hillary Clinton's reputation, not that it vindicated her opponents, but that it established a framework where accountability could be pursued across party lines, where questions could be asked without fear of automatic partisan defense, where silence could be recognized as meaningful, where the phrase "I don't recall" could be challenged rather than accepted, where 4 seconds could matter more than 40 years of survival. On April 20th, exactly 1 month after the hearing, Hillary Clinton gave a speech at a women's leadership conference in Chicago. The speech was about resilience and perseverance. She talked about her career, the challenges she had faced, the investigations she had survived, the importance of continuing to fight even when opponents seem overwhelming. Near the end, she addressed the March 18th hearing directly for the first time since her immediate post-hearing statement. She said, "Last month, I sat in a hearing room and answered questions for 3 hours. Some of you have asked me about it. Some of you have expressed concern. Let me be clear. I have been investigated more times than any woman in American history. I have faced hostile committees and partisan prosecutors and media scrutiny that would have ended the careers of most politicians. And I am still here, not because I am above accountability, but because the investigations have consistently shown that the allegations against me are politically motivated rather than fact-based. My record does speak for itself. 40 years of public service. Millions of people helped through my work at the State Department and the Clinton Foundation. Historic advocacy for women's rights and children's welfare. That record is not erased by one hearing where my political opponents tried to relitigate old controversies. The audience applauded. It was a strong audience for her. Women who admired her perseverance, supporters who had defended her for years, people who saw her as a victim of sexism and partisan attack. For them, the speech was validating. But outside that room, the reaction was more mixed, because the speech did exactly what the March 18th hearing had revealed. It invoked her record. It described the investigations as partisan. It framed her survival as evidence of innocence. But it did not answer the questions. When did you know about your husband's relationship with Epstein? Why did you resist testifying? Have you ever admitted you were wrong? The speech addressed none of these directly, and media coverage noted the omission. Even outlets that were generally sympathetic to Clinton pointed out that she had not provided new information, that she had relied on her standard framework of persecution and perseverance, that the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The Washington Post published an analysis on April 22 titled, "Clinton's Chicago Speech Shows Why the March Hearing Resonated." The article argued that Clinton's continued reliance on deflection and contextualization rather than direct answers was precisely what had made the Vance hearing so powerful. The article quoted the exchange. "Have you ever said I was wrong and told the complete truth?" 4 seconds of silence. "I believe my record speaks for itself." "Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does." The article concluded. Until Clinton can answer that question with a specific example rather than a general invocation of her record, the questions raised on March 18th will continue to define her legacy. This was harsh but not unfair analysis, and it reflected a broader shift in how Clinton was being covered, not as a victim of partisan attack, not as a champion of resilience, but as a political figure whose 4 decades of evasion had finally been made visible in a way that could not be explained away. The survivors continued to speak. Throughout April and into May, more women who had been trafficked by Epstein gave interviews and testimony. They spoke about the power dynamics that had protected Epstein for so long, the wealth, the connections, the famous names, the assumption that powerful people were beyond accountability. They spoke about how they had been dismissed and discredited when they first came forward, how they had been told that no one would believe them against people like Bill Clinton, how they had waited for years for someone in power to ask the right questions. And they spoke about March 18th, about watching J.D. Vance ask those questions, about watching Hillary Clinton not answer, about the 4 seconds of silence that said more than any answer could, about feeling, for the first time, that the power dynamic might finally be shifting. One woman, who had testified in a civil case against Epstein years earlier and who had been 31 when she watched the hearing, said something in an interview that captured what many survivors felt. She said, "I spent 15 years being angry that powerful people got away with knowing Jeffrey Epstein while girls like me suffered. I was angry that they could say, 'I don't recall,' and everyone just accepted it. I was angry that they could invoke their records and everyone moved on. But when I watched that hearing, I was not angry anymore. I was hopeful because I saw someone in power refuse to accept 'I don't recall' as an answer. I saw someone ask the simplest question, 'Have you ever admitted you were wrong?' And I saw 4 seconds of silence that told the truth more clearly than any speech could. I saw power confronted with the one thing it cannot survive: simplicity, direct questions, no escape routes. That gave me hope, not that justice will be done. I am not naive enough to believe that yet, but hope that maybe the conversation is changing, that maybe 'I don't recall' is not enough anymore, that maybe power will have to answer." This was the real impact of the March 18th hearing. Not that it ended Hillary Clinton's career, not that it resulted in criminal charges, not even that it changed public opinion decisively, but that it changed the framework. It established that 'I don't recall' could be challenged, that 4 decades of survival did not equal accountability, that the simplest questions could be the most powerful, that silence could be evidence, that maybe, finally, power would have to answer. By June, 3 months after the hearing, the political and cultural landscape had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. The phrase "my record speaks for itself" had entered the lexicon as shorthand for political evasion. Saturday Night Live did a sketch where every character responded to every question with "my record speaks for itself," followed by another character saying "yes, it does." Late-night hosts used the exchange as a punchline, but beneath the humor was substance. The idea that political figures owed direct answers rather than contextual deflections had gained traction. Congressional hearings changed in subtle ways. Witnesses found that "I don't recall" was being challenged more aggressively. That invoking decades of service did not immunize you from specific questions. That the framework established on March 18th, ask specific questions, compare answers to documents, let silence speak, was being adopted by other committee chairs and other investigators. This was J.D. Vance's real legacy from the hearing, not the viral moment, not the political damage to Clinton, but the demonstration of technique, how to conduct oversight, how to ask questions, how to refuse deflection, how to make evasion visible without raising your voice or making speeches. Other politicians noticed. Other committee chairs studied the transcript. Other investigators recognized that anger and volume had not worked against Hillary Clinton, but precision and patience had. The technique spread. Hillary Clinton remained active. She continued to give speeches. She continued to write op-eds. She continued to appear on cable news. She remained influential in Democratic politics. Her supporters remained loyal, but something had changed. The automatic assumption that she would survive any controversy was gone. The framework that had protected her for 40 years, survive the investigation, claim partisan attack, invoke your record, no longer worked as reliably. Democrats were less unanimous in their defense. Media coverage was more critical, and the question remained unanswered. Have you ever admitted you were wrong? On June 15th, 3 months to the day after the hearing, J.D. Vance appeared on a Sunday news show. The host asked him about Clinton, about whether he thought the hearing had been fair, about whether he had achieved what he set out to achieve. Vance said, "I set out to ask questions that needed to be asked, about emails, about the dossier, about the foundation, about Epstein, questions with specific dates and specific facts. Secretary Clinton chose how to answer. The American people watched. They compared her answers to the documentary record. They made their own judgments. That is how oversight is supposed to work." The host pressed, "But you asked her whether she had ever admitted being wrong. That was not a question about Epstein or emails. That was personal." Was it personal, Vance asked, or was it the most important question? Because if someone cannot point to a single example in 40 years of public life where they admitted a mistake and told the complete truth, what does that tell you about their relationship with accountability? That is not personal. That is fundamental. If you believe you are never wrong, or if you cannot admit being wrong even when you are not fit for public office. That is not partisan. That is basic. The host asked whether he thought Clinton would ever answer that question. Vance almost smiled. "She already did," he said. 4 seconds of silence is an answer. The clip was viewed 2 million times. And in those 2 million views and the thousands of comments and reactions and debates it sparked, the fundamental question remained alive. Not are you guilty? Not are you indicted? Are you accountable? Do you answer questions? Do you admit mistakes? Do you tell the truth? Or do you spend 40 years perfecting the art of survival through evasion? Hillary Clinton's record spoke for itself. And yes, as J.D. Vance had said on March 18th, it does. But what it said depended on who was listening. For her supporters, it said, 40 years of service and surviving countless partisan attacks. For her critics, it said, 40 years of avoiding accountability through legal maneuvering and deflection. For neutral observers, it said, 4 seconds of silence when asked the simplest question about admitting mistakes. All 3 interpretations were valid. All 3 were based on facts. And that was the legacy. Not a definitive verdict. Not a clear exoneration or condemnation. But a record that spoke for itself in different ways to different people. And a question that remained unanswered. Have you ever admitted you were wrong? 4 seconds of silence. That was the answer. That was the record. That was the legacy. Power protecting itself. Surviving but never truly accountable. 40 years of public service. 4 seconds of silence. Both true. Both part of the same story. Both speaking for themselves. And in the end, that was the real revelation of March 18th, 2026. Not that Hillary Clinton was guilty or innocent. Not that she should be prosecuted or exonerated, but that she represented something larger. A system where power protects power. Where survival is mistaken for vindication. Where "I don't recall" is accepted as an answer. Where 40 years of investigation without prosecution is treated as proof of innocence rather than evidence of connections. where the simplest question, have you ever admitted you were wrong, can produce 4 seconds of silence. That system had been made visible, not destroyed, not changed overnight, but made visible, and once something is visible, it can be challenged. That was what J.D. Vance had done on March 18th. He had made the system visible. He had asked the questions that revealed the mechanism. He had refused the deflections that sustained it. He had let silence speak, and the country had watched. Some saw vindication of their long-held beliefs about the Clintons. Some saw a partisan attack disguised as oversight, but most saw something simpler and more important. They saw how power operates when questioned directly, how it evades, how it contextualizes, how it survives. And they saw that maybe, finally, survival alone is not enough, that maybe accountability matters more than endurance, that maybe 4 seconds of silence says more than 40 years of speeches. The hearing ended at 12:03 in the afternoon on March 18, 2026, but its impact continued. In congressional hearings, in media coverage, in public expectations, in the language of political accountability. My record speaks for itself became the phrase that defined an era, not because it was compelling, but because it was finally recognized for what it was, not an answer, an evasion. And after March 18th, evasions were no longer enough.